Another way to look at it, and something I've been talking about a lot, is the concept of neutrality, Bitcoin neutrality. The internet provides neutrality as to sender, recipient, and content of message. It provides routing of these messages and packets without considerations as the sender and recipient. And in Bitcoin, we have the same thing. The sender, recipient, value, and content of the transaction script do not determine whether your transaction will be routed, simply whether it is a valid transaction and whether the output can be properly verified and used as an input in the next transaction. These schemes break that neutrality and would introduce a level of centralization that would not allow you to do innovation at the edges anymore.
Yeah, I guess that's true also. So what I was thinking of in terms of the idealized features for a distributed electronic cash system, we were exploring this in sort of 1998, 1999 timeframe with sort of Wade Days, B-Money, Hal Finney was involved, some anonymous people, one of whom may have been Satoshi, it's not clear. And Nick Szabo made a related proposal called BitGold. It involved broadcast to avoid the risks of centralization, and actually it related to a specific previous failed experiment with a centralized solution. So there was a company in the sort of 1995 era who had a electronic cash technology invented by David Chaum, who's really kind of the progenitor of electronic cash, because he invented the blind signature with very interesting applications for electronic cash, and is a very clever cryptographer. So he started this company in the Netherlands called DigiCash, and they put up a demonstration electronic cash server. The actual end game was to obtain banking licenses or partner with banks and exchange electronic cash tokens worth exactly $1 for $. So there's no kind of virtual scarcity involved, but there is immediate and final settlement, and also the concept of the user holding their own token. So it's kind of virtual digital bearer certificate, so a kind of electronic version of a bearer bond.
Yeah, full control in the hands of the person who has possession.
Right, so they put up this demo server with no banking connection and a kind of Bitcoin Faucet equivalent thing, which is you could just email them and they send you a few coins. And so people on the cryptography list were very interested in deploying electronic cash, because you can immediately see with any kind of encryption or privacy-related or network privacy-related technologies or internet services that you can make things work more smoothly if you can have money involved. And sometimes it's difficult to have money involved where there's no transactional privacy if you're trying to provide privacy-related services. So people pretty much viewed electronic cash as the holy grail of the privacy technologies they were exploring. Anyway, so this Betabuck server, people got interested and thought, well, why don't we start buying and selling things and see if we can inflate the balloon? There's scarcity. DigiCash promised to only ever issue 1 million of these and to leave it running, basically. And so I sold some T-shirts relating to encryption policy at the time, and other people sold other things. And if that had been able to run its course, perhaps within a year or two, within a community of a few thousand interested people, that might actually have floated and achieved a value. But unfortunately, around that time, DigiCash went bankrupt, and the server got shut down, and because of its architecture, the double spend database, which defines the value, basically you end up holding a coin that you fully control, but it's defined with respect to a double spend database. If the double spend database disappears, nobody knows whether your coin was already spent or not, and they have no proof of that. So all the coins became worthless overnight. And so it was within that context that Wade Day proposed B-Money, and I presume that Nick Szabo proposed BitGold also. So basically try and distribute that double spend database. And also Wade Day particularly had proposed to try to create a distributed electronic currency without a banking interface by using Hashcash as a kind of virtual mining function. And some aspects of his proposal were kind of slightly vague or, high-level broad brushstrokes. But so I think one of the things was you would send a Hashcash proof of work, which is non-transferable, to a group of cloud servers, and they would issue with a blind token or would track ownership in some not fully defined way. And in this discussion, I proposed that, well, if you mine a coin yourself, you don't need to exchange it with a server. It is a virgin coin. So that's kind of the Bitcoin virgin coin concept, the virgin mined coin that is valid in itself. And Nick Szabo had a kind of related idea involving a collectible market. So you can see that when you mine these things, there's Moore's law going on and people jumping in, so that you get bigger and bigger Hashcash stamps over time. And so apparently there's a collectible market. So I guess Nick Szabo has a more experience in markets and law and other aspects of the existing financial ecosystem. So he had picked out a specialized kind of market called a collectible market, where apparently specialist traders will piece together collectible assets like rare postage stamps and things like that and put them together into a bundle with a fixed value, even though the components have different ages and scarcities and values. So he's proposing a collectibles market to stabilize the value of these changing, like increasingly less scarce stamps. Unfortunately, neither of these systems had any way to control inflation, so we were thinking, I mean, actually my kind of design consideration going into it is that I was aiming for inflation-adjusted US dollar. So basically what I was trying to achieve was that if you wanted to get a US dollar in electronic cash, what you would do is you would burn a US dollar's worth of electricity. So if you didn't have the time on your computer to do that, you would go rent it from a big compute farm. Within a few seconds, you'd get back your US dollar and you'd pay your US dollar in fees. And that's an interesting and, in fact, extremely fair distribution model because nobody gets rich and you can get it on demand and there's no limitation. There's no supply curve. It fully meets demand, and once you have a dollar, you can't convert it back, but you can use it within the system. So some kind of stabilization would occur.
It's like virtualizing that dollar, essentially.
Right, so it's kind of an attractive proposition, but unfortunately I kind of stalled on that because you can't really do that. Well, I mean, you can do it. Somebody can buy a computer every month, the most efficient, cost-effective computer, measure how big a stamp it can produce for a dollar's worth of electricity, and set an exchange rate. But unfortunately, that's a centralized event. That rate setter becomes the Ben Bernanke or the monetary policy unit of the virtual currency, and that's undesirable. You want a distributed situation, so you could have multiple people doing that, but it's still undesirable. It involves human judgment, and so on. So alternatively, we looked also at what could be done without reference to an external entity, and you could see that if you just left it, you can mine as fast as you want, and a coin is 20 bits or something, which was the default hash cache size, a million iterations of a hash. With Moore's law and increasing demand, you would have a supply-side inflation tracking Moore's law or worse, which we viewed as too violent to be a practical adoption mechanism. And conversely, if we put a cap, as Betabucks, DigiCash Betabucks experiment had of, say, 1 million or 1 billion of these currency units, we would have had violent deflation if we just started from that, and and who would own them, right? So, and then if somebody pre-mined them all definitionally and handed them out, that puts them in a position of power. Alternatively, if you have, free-for-all people mining, you'd have a period of hyperinflation followed by hyperdeflation, and we just viewed this as an untenable. If we'd have figured out a way to control that, there were lots of people there raring to go to implement it, but we just figured that this was uncontrollable and so not plausible as an adoption mechanism. And actually, curiously, there was one of the people that was participating in this discussion anonymously seemed more interested to continue this line of thinking. He kind of, like, his last post in the thread was that this seems a very promising avenue and should be explored further. So possibly you could think that might have been Satoshi, and he's been mulling it over ever since and finally got around to...
So about a decade of mulling it over.
Yeah, I mean, possibly with, who knows, I guess I heard indirectly that somebody said that he had said approximately how long he'd been working on it, maybe a couple of years or something, so maybe, a period of mulling it over and some ideas emerging, and then 2 years of implementation. I mean, so the missing part we had there back in 98, 99, and this thread is on the Cypherpunks list. It's still there. You can go look at it. It's kind of interesting.
It's now the historical record for the birth of our new currency.
Right, eCash archaeology or something. Yeah. The missing feature that we had there was how to control this inflation. So because of my asking the wrong question and looking for exactly $1 cost to mining. And there's a downside to that, which is an extremely inefficient method of deployment. If you literally adopted that, which I was thinking about at the time actually, and it went to global scale, we would basically burn $1 trillion worth of coal to get $1 trillion worth of electronic currency to operate with it, and that would be a quite undesirable outcome. So I think Satoshi's main big innovation was to come up with a mathematical supply function, which kind of solved three problems. It's an internal reference. It's fully decentralized. It achieves more efficient distribution because the electricity costs are much lower. I mean, even at this stage now that we have mining, there's not actually that strong an incentive to go crazy and buy lots and lots of ASIC mining equipment because you'll just remove the profit motive, essentially. Mm-hmm. So there is an equilibrium, and the people that mined early on, they did it for very negligible cost. So they were lucky, but they also produced an electrically efficient distribution of electronic cash. And the final thing that this mathematical supply function created was a drive to adoption. So, I mean, even though it's a supply-side inflation, it's experienced as deflation from the user's point of view, i.e. the coins that you hold going up in value, because the rate of adoption has exceeded the supply-side inflation. So over the first 4 years, 50% of coins were mined, so it's 12.5% a year. Now we're in a 6.25% a year, and after that we'll be going to 3 1/8. So So within 3 years, you can see the supply-side inflation is quite low and comparable to existing national currencies already. It seems that the parameters of the system were very well chosen. I mean, maybe with some very clever and careful economic modelling, or maybe with some luck and good guesswork, educated guesswork. But
yes, obviously we know that now because it has worked, and so we can say that the parameters were well chosen. But when it was first suggested, I think a lot of people pointed at it and laughed and said this can't possibly work, which is probably the hallmark of many good inventions in science.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really curious situation that I actually, the only Bitcoins I own, I bought in the market this year. I mined, 3/4 of Bitcoin on a GPU. My son has a couple of small ASIC miners, a teenage son at the moment that he's mining. But I was aware of and participated in this previous attempt to inflate the bubble. I was aware of Bitcoin from September 2008 because Satoshi sent me an email. And he sent me another email in January. So it's September 2008. He sent me another email in January 2009 saying I've released the alpha version of the client, download it, try it out. And I didn't.
Yeah,
I sat outside the market and I was very interested technically in what he'd achieved, and I read with interest how Finney's experiments in exploring, how it worked, trying it out, asking technical comments, and engaging Satoshi and others in discussion of this on the crypto list, and I participated in that myself. But for whatever reason, the connection to the inflation or the probability of the balloon inflating didn't catch me until I saw $100 and $1 billion market cap, and I thought, oh, it's happened.
Right, well, that's a relief because many of us missed a couple of iterations of that and felt really dumb for not noticing it earlier. And to know that someone who has been as influential in the development of these technologies could also miss it. It's really one of those things that in theory seems bizarre, but then suddenly when it gains the market traction, it all falls into place. And in hindsight, it's very easy to say, well, yeah, obviously this was the right way to do it. But that's really just observer bias.
Yeah, I mean, so you could say that I was dumber than everybody else because I had prior experience of attempts to inflate a currency. I understood the cryptography and the principles involved, and I tried to design something similar in the past. So I have trouble explaining to myself why I didn't. But I mean, I think it's harder for someone who's so involved in these things and also sees many of the alternative options that could be chosen to see which one is the right one. Whereas a lot of the adoption we see right now is probably just speculative sentiment and has nothing to do with understanding the fundamentals. In fact, the more you understand the fundamentals, the more excited you are about how amazing it is that this is all working. As I recall it, I mean, it's a few years now ago that I was thinking, well, I recognized it as a bootstrap experiment, obviously, and I thought that's an interesting bootstrap experiment, but for some reason it felt like it was a very big inflation job. The balloon was vast, so that's to say that it was starting at a very tiny level and it had a very big area to reach, so it seemed quite low probability to reach it, but in hindsight that's not actually very much the case. It had almost identical characteristics to the BetaBucks server. Anyway, so I'm not at all bitter about it. I have skin in the game because I bought Bitcoins with my own money. They went up, I don't know, 3 times or something at the moment.
And it's still really early days. We're still on the foothills, so there's plenty of opportunity to help form this new industry.
Right, I wanted to say something also. So looking at it from the outside, you see, when I was exploring electronic cash, I had the background of looking at the cryptographic side where they have all these advanced experimental protocols. So you see David Chaum's eCash, and David Chaum's PhD student, who's a friend of mine, Stefan Brands, developed a much more sophisticated form of electronic cash with many more features and flexibilities. That these things have cryptographic blinding, which enables you to have mathematically perfect fungibility. And so when I saw Bitcoin, I saw that it had a kind of fudge for its fungibility level. So to my point of view, that was not ideal. So I mean, potentially if it had a more idealized fungibility layer, I might have been more excited about its prospects. Now, obviously, it's very difficult to achieve a distributed version because Stefan Brand's technology and before him David Chaum's technology are single server technologies, or potentially cluster of server. You see Open Transactions as a kind of federated model where they have a semi-trustless group of Chaum or other kind of centralized cache servers that can perform some kind of hybrid, some interesting properties, less vulnerable to centralization risks as central server digicache type servers, but less decentralized than Bitcoin itself. So it's actually quite technically challenging to obtain cryptographic anonymity within Bitcoin, and some of the esoteric crypto protocols for doing these things are experimental, and it can be a risk for when there's real money at stake to use very cutting-edge experimental crypto protocols because they may be broken in a period of 10 years. And even if they've been around for 15 years, let's say, if they've been esoteric and there's been no real reason to analyze them, they might not actually have had that much work put into it. But actually there was a protocol which was compatible with distributed use, which is a paper by Sandra and Tashma called Auditable Electronic Cache, which was published in 1999, and that involves a zero-knowledge proof of set membership. And the ZeroCoin paper refers to that, and ZeroCoin is essentially an optimization of the anonymous auditable eCache. So when I first saw Bitcoin, my immediate thought was, well, you could have used Sandra and Tashma's Auditable Anonymous Electronic Cache protocol, fits perfectly with the network properties of this system, and would provide a perfect fungibility layer. Now, unfortunately, Sandra and Tashma's protocol is somewhat computationally heavy and inefficient because it involves cut-and-choose cryptographic proofs, which involve multiple rounds and large messages and so on. And you see that ZeroCoin has the same problems. It's an optimization, but even with that optimization, it's still almost impractically inefficient. The coins are sort of 20 to 40 kilobytes per coin. They have a single denomination. So you typically, let's say you would need to have a 1 cent coin. If I want to send you $50, I have to send you, 5,000 times 40 kilobytes of data, or I have to split the coins up into denominations, so like in powers of 2, 1 cent, 2 cent, 4 cent, heading up to, 16,384 cents. And by doing that, you would reduce the anonymity set, so you would weaken the anonymity, and still there would be significant expense. So I do see desirability of having cryptographic anonymity, and apparently the guys at Johns Hopkins University, Matthew Green and colleagues, have a new paper that is in the works. They've been sort of making comments about that they're going to publish it soon, so we'll see what that achieves. They claim to have achieved some much greater efficiency, and I guess not too much can be said about it yet because they haven't formally published it, but I think the risks that it will face are to do with the type of crypto it uses. If it's using very cutting-edge crypto, again, even if they've solved largely the feature requirements of getting the computational and space efficiency, as long as the verification efficiency is reasonable, the creation efficiency, we can play with that somewhat. It doesn't matter so much if that's somewhat computationally expensive or memory intensive or what have you. In that circumstance, the problem is that if it's involving experimental cryptography, you run the risk that if you say, okay, let's adopt this for Bitcoin, if somebody makes some new group theory attack or some mathematical attack over the next 5 to 10 years, it could be a currency catastrophe of like economic global scale.
Right. So at least we can somewhat trust the ECDSA to be thoroughly tested and rely on it for decades.
Right. So in fact, it's a curious artifact that Bitcoin itself is using only very simple conservative cryptography. And actually, I had some thoughts about the fungibility layer. So hypothetically, if we had the desirable fungibility layer, so if we had, let's say, ZeroCoin 2, their papers say it has ideal properties, and let's say there's a ZeroCoin 3, rather, which by the Johns Hopkins authors or by any other author. So a cryptographically perfect fungibility layer, which would hide who's paying who, how much, and avoid any anonymity set limitations. So you have a full anonymity set between all the holders of Bitcoin. Now, in that circumstance, you have a quite extreme form of anonymity, anonymous payments. One person can pay another person 1 cent or $1 billion, and there's nothing anybody can do about it ever to determine what just happened. You can't trace it.
Can't see it, can't stop it, can't trace it.
And you can say that, there may be some limits to that, which is, it would typically be the case with any anonymity protocol that the sender would keep a transcript, or could keep a transcript, and so the sender may be able to retain a proof that he could reveal in case of subpoena to show who he sent it to. And so there could be some limited traceability, but I think it's entirely possible also to build different privacy features. So if you view the fungibility layer as about fungibility purely, which is to say that enforces that a dollar is a dollar and you don't get any red listing or taint tracking attacks that affect transaction cost into the fungibility layer. Above that, we have a payment layer, and already we have the Bitcoin payment protocol with sort of identification for the web server, so you know you're paying the right person. So I think the correct place to manage identity is in the payment protocol layer, and to keep the transaction layer pure to avoid transaction cost leakage. Now, you can add or manage all kinds of different privacy layers, and you have a lot of flexibility, and it's all using standard, very simple cryptography at that layer once you have the perfect cryptographic fungibility layer. So, for example, you can use the existing Bitcoin sort of self-chosen account number, pseudonym model, where you have an address that your computer has generated. You could choose to reuse that address, and actually, contrary to de facto advice, many Bitcoin clients, many Bitcoin wallets reuse addresses, which actually damages the fungibility layer as present. But with perfect fungibility, you could reuse the address just for convenience. And what that would mean is that, if you paid one person, you paid another person, you'd have a similar kind of linkability that you have in the Bitcoin protocol at present, which could be visible or could be encrypted between the users if that's arranged, so that a user could be presented, so a business entity with business records could be presented with a subpoena to prove the account numbers that it transacted with if somebody was trying to trace some funds for some kind of crime-related event. In your interactions with regulated businesses, you could provide identity. So, for example, the analogy of going into a gun shop with a passport, proving you're eligible to own a gun in the United States, handing over cash over the counter to pay for the gun. There's no identity attached to the cash. The identity is attached to the transaction. You show the passport. And so you see the same thing. You could do that with a regulated business using Bitcoin. So actually that was my objection to the red listing train of thinking, is that you don't want to extract that from the fungibility layer, so you damage the fungibility layer. If you do want to provide a facility to help people run regulated businesses, you provide some mechanism for a digital driver's license that smooths the path to signing up to exchanges, where currently you have to fax them scan and send them high-resolution scans of your utility bills and passport and what have you. You could have an electronic version of that that's validated by a registration authority in the same way that you have certificates issued by a certification authority and a registration authority that verifies the underlying documents and proofs.
Yeah, the idea that somehow the only way to solve crime is to track everybody's money all the time is insidious. And, crime was solved before money was trackable, and trackable money is a recent invention. Somehow people managed to solve crime when a lot of transactions were entirely in cash, and we didn't need every bill tracked. So it's really a new invention, right?
Yes, very much so. And actually,
can we stop it in Bitcoin? Can we provide a fix that will solve this problem at a protocol layer before it becomes implemented by governments?
I mean, we have a number of best effort technologies, and there are things we can do to improve the fungibility layer within the scope of Bitcoin itself, with existing protocols. So encourage more Bitcoin wallets to not reuse addresses. As I understand it, the Eligius pool is discouraging reuse addresses by prioritizing single-use addresses, prioritizing the processing of single-use addresses.
Oh, wow.
And there's a protocol by Greg Maxwell called CoinJoin, which provides a kind of trustless way to improve fungibility. So basically, there's some kind of traceability in the Bitcoin network to do with change addresses and so on. And the CoinJoin protocol, which can be implemented in a server, and I understand blockchain.info has done that, and maybe some other actors, can also be implemented in the client, which I think is an even more interesting place to put it, can basically slightly enhance the existing fungibility mechanism. And I think people should understand that this is not necessarily about achieving anonymity. It's about retaining the value in Bitcoin. Bitcoin's value, in a large part, I suspect, depends on the fungibility of the coins, because otherwise the transaction costs rise to reach credit cards, and then it no longer has a transactional advantage. So I think it's in the interest of every significant holder of Bitcoin to ensure that we draw a line in the sand and don't encourage or condone or make use of any systems which try to encourage red listing and therefore damage fungibility. So I view CoinJoin as a good, practical, immediate step that can be taken. And you see that also the dark wallet with Amir Taki and Vitalik Buterin and some other participants. They're implementing peer-to-peer mediated CoinJoin within the dark wallet client. So that will basically become the wallet that most strongly strengthens fungibility, which is important for Bitcoin. So once they get that implemented, I would encourage other users to look at their innovation in terms of the peer-to-peer mechanism that they will have to develop to achieve that.
One of the things we've learned about practical application of cryptography tools and privacy tools for a broad audience was that things that require technical expertise and power users, like PGP email, never achieves mass scale. But things that were on by default, always on, and in many cases without the user's choice, like SSL, have been much more effective at bringing mass adoption of these capabilities. Do you see the same issue with CoinJoin? Do we really need to make this the default selection for every wallet so the user is doing coin remixing whether they know it or not, and every transaction is CoinJoined?
Yes, I mean, I think until we have a stronger cryptographic solution that doesn't rely on potentially risky cutting-edge crypto, that's the best we have. And I mean, I don't really like to call it mixing because I don't really view it about anonymity. I view it about fungibility. You know, there's still tracking outside of that in terms of people are interacting with websites at the payment level. So there's still trackability at the payment level, at the TCP/IP level. TCP/IP addresses are connectable to physical addresses, or even by, you can look up geolocation, but ISPs retain logs. So there's very much trackability and identity involved in 99% of Bitcoin users who are not bad actors, existing Bitcoin payment processors, merchants, and so on. So really it's not about mixing, which is a kind of anonymity term, but it's about a fungibility mechanism to cryptographically enforce fungibility with this kind of, it is mixing technically at a technical level, but it's about retaining fungibility.
Yeah, so fungibility is one of the core principles that gives Bitcoin its strength.
Right.
We should not give up that capability, and if we do so, and if we fail to recognize the signs that some of these perhaps misguided but well-meaning attempts to prevent fraud by modifying the fungibility of the protocol can ultimately have very destructive consequences on the value of the currency by essentially PayPalizing it or turning it into a credit card equivalent.
Right. So, I mean, I think any kind of identity management should happen at the payment level, and we've already got steps towards that with the payment protocol that Mike Hearn proposed. There's a BIP, it's being implemented.
BIP 70, BIP 71 for the payment protocol, yeah.
Right. And actually the payment protocol itself provides a new privacy feature independent from CoinJoin, which can be used in conjunction with it, which is that one of the things that links transactions is the transaction amount. If addresses are not reduced, the main thing that leaks it is the transaction amount and the change address, if the transaction amount is unique. And so one thing you can do within the payment protocol is you can request multiple addresses from the merchant. So, if you're paying $10.95 for something, you can pay $5 and $5 and build it up out of change that has more even values. So that makes it stand out less in terms of looking at the Bitcoin transaction network, which is the change address, and whether these two payments, two $5 payments, are actually involving the same user and the same merchant. If it's done properly, that may not be so obvious.
So you don't need to combine many of your smaller inputs, thereby tainting them with each other, which would also reveal prior relationships between them. So there's another layer to that. That's very interesting.
And I mean, at present, the Bitcoin wallets are not doing anything intelligent in terms of their change management. So there's a feature called Coin Control, which aims to make more intelligent use of change to sort of try to minimize the number of change values within your wallet, because it's pretty much when you combine values. So, if you've got like 110 cents left over as you have your jar of change at home, if you start using that in Bitcoin terms, that's what tends to link your payments together. I wanted to say something else about the tendency to think that it's necessary to put innovation into altcoins. So I went through an evolution of thinking about this when I first really got deeply involved in understanding the Bitcoin limitations and trying to help move them forward sort of about 6 months ago, early this year. I thought that the proposals could be potentially integrated into Bitcoin, but over time I realized that the Bitcoin core developers have this challenge we discussed earlier, that they can't accept high-risk changes because they've got to be so careful about testing. And so then you start to think, well, maybe you could put this in one of the altcoins, but to do that presents a new risk to Bitcoin, which I think potentially the world can only really support one virtual scarce currency, because if one of the altcoins were hypothetically to reach parity with Bitcoin, firstly that has no intrinsic value, which is a kind of dangerous position in itself. But if psychologically people jumped onto it, I say no intrinsic value because there's no transaction load in there. If hypothetically people were to, Bitcoin holders, the speculative component of Bitcoin's value, were to jump into this altcoin, you might see some, like a Bitcoin price collapse and the altcoin taking off. And then maybe actual transactions moving to the network, or transactions happening via Bitcoin, sort of currency conversion from the alt to Bitcoin to the merchant, because Bitcoin also has all the infrastructure. But once you had this kind of unhealthy situation, you might see holders of this new altcoin looking nervously over their shoulder at the next altcoin, which was in a similar position, no intrinsic value, but it's gaining on value on it speculatively. And basically, once people were to experience this kind of thing, it might say, well, wait a minute, what does virtual scarcity mean? If everybody can come along and propose some kind of parameter tweak or small functional change to get users' interest, or even the name or affiliation with a celebrity or something silly like that, people might start to question the very core principle of virtual scarce commodity. So I think it's really best to focus on and stick with the one bootstrapped currency, and I don't think it's really a fair proposition to go into an altcoin, because now that it's happened once, people are looking at it as something that is much more plausible. Stating my dislike for that, I mean, there's a financial risk there for the Bitcoin stability and long-term viability of digital scarcity, which I think is, I think digital scarcity is a huge invention for society that basically Satoshi enabled with this new innovation of controlled supply. I think it'd be a very unfortunate end for Bitcoin if that were to collapse or be significantly weakened by a kind of speculative bubbles in altcoins that were to start to compete with Bitcoin for market cap. So having stated that reservation, what do I propose that people could do about that? And what I propose is that they could put it in Bitcoin. So we know that's challenging, but I proposed a way to put new features into Bitcoin without risking Bitcoin value. And basically the way you do that is you start a new altcoin. We'll call it Bitcoin 2. So Bitcoin is currently on version 0.89 something. So as with operating systems and other software packages, it's quite common for there to be a beta version. It's not an alpha version. It's relatively stable. It's not going to eat your data, lose your files, corrupt your computer. So you put the features into the beta version, and there's development in parallel. People are maintaining bug fixes, as in Bitcoin, on the current stable version, and they're adding the missing features to the beta version. And you could view it as the way you see with Red Hat and Fedora. Red Hat is extremely well tested, and enterprises can rely on it for rock-steady service for important websites. Fedora is adding new features all the time. Periodically, there will be a new major release of Red Hat, which pulls in the features from Fedora, stabilizes it, and uses it. So what I would like to see for Bitcoin is for Bitcoin to adopt this development model. And so because it's a currency, there's a question of, can you put value in the Fedora of Bitcoin, in the Bitcoin 2? And it turns out there is a way to do that while avoiding importing risk back into the main Bitcoin network. And what you can do is have a mathematical one-way peg between Bitcoin and Bitcoin 2, which is to say you're allowed to move an existing Bitcoin into the Bitcoin 2 network. But the Bitcoin 2 network has no native reward mining. It would probably be merge mined with Bitcoin. And by doing this, there would be a market price to move the coins back. And by doing it this way, you preserve the 21 million coin promise, like that cap is maintained through the evolution of features and through the move between major new features. So you could imagine sort of a timeline of, say, 1 year or 18 months or whatever cycle makes sense for testing resources available to move between these things. And, as it gets closer to the switchover time, people would move coins over, and you could algorithmically move the remaining coins over and then start the process again and move forward in that way. So it's
not just about how you implement the technology, it's also how you implement the currency infrastructure and the balance between main coin, altcoin, or in this case, main coin and dev coin, essentially, that's happened, the development coin or beta coin that's happening to promote these new features.
Basically, it's a rejection of the idea that you should push innovation into altcoins, because I view that as an existential risk to the very concept of digital scarcity, as well as being, pure speculation. And it also detracts from the Bitcoin mindshare and the basic model. And the interesting thing about having a one-way peg is you can't introduce a two-way peg, because while you're being very careful on the Bitcoin 2, you are adding new features. If something bad happens, despite the best efforts, you don't want that risk being imported into Bitcoin. Right. So because there's a Volve or one-way peg, if you want to go back into Bitcoin, you have to buy it at market. And if a vulnerability is discovered, until that's fixed, that market will freeze up, so there'll be no risk to Bitcoin.
The price will diverge, essentially.
Temporarily, until the issue is fixed, unless it's a... Yeah.
And that provides enough friction to keep people in Bitcoin 2, allowing you the fix to happen so that you can then recover that.
Right, yes. And I think people, one worry people might have is to say that, well, the technical mechanism by which you move bitcoins into the Bitcoin 2 is technically you destroy the bitcoin. And so they view that as somehow aesthetically unpleasing, that you've destroyed this beautiful red number or something. But actually, it's just a technical mechanism to move a coin. So you can still verify that this is a mined coin when it's been moved into the other network. You look with a reference of where it came from when you look at the mining event. So, and as long as people can see a promise and timeline that the Bitcoin 2 network will become the Bitcoin network within some approximate timeline, they shouldn't have too much reservation about putting money into it. You could see in the short term that, if somebody needs to move money back or prefers to move money back after they've used the features in Bitcoin 2 for long-time storage into the original Bitcoin network, that there might be a mismatch between the markets. So anybody who wants to move Bitcoins into Bitcoin 2 can do it by destroying a coin, so there's no loss to them to accept a trade coming back the other way. But if there's a trade imbalance in the other direction, the coins could potentially sell below par. But I think if there's an implied promise that it doesn't really matter, if you just wait another 6 months or something, all the coins are going to be equivalent because they're all going to move into, the Bitcoin's going to move on to the next version anyway, then it should combat any kind of extreme fluctuations. And if there are fluctuations with that implied promise there, if there's a significant discount, people will buy them to hold them for the year, basically, because it'll be an arbitrage opportunity with a quite certain payout. I mean, there's no counterparty risk.
Hi, listener. Here at Let's Talk Bitcoin, we're building a global network of correspondents able to contribute on-the-ground perspective when cryptocurrency-related information comes across their filters. If you'd like to join our global conversation, send an email with your name and geographic or cultural niche to apply@letstalkbitcoin.com. Just like Bitcoin, the only barrier to entry is your time and good work. Thanks for listening.